The morning of the 12th of January, 1888, started at 46 degrees above zero in Kingsbury County, Dakota Territory. That number matters, so hold it for a moment. 46 degrees in January, on the northern plains where the ground had been frozen solid since November, and the nearest tree, taller than a man, stood 7 miles east along the James River. Children ran outside without coats. Farmers loaded grain without mittens. A woman in De Smet opened her window and hung a wet blanket to dry. After weeks of bitter cold, it felt like the earth had forgiven them something. By 4 o'clock that afternoon, the temperature was negative 22. That swing, 68 degrees in roughly 5 hours, killed somewhere between 235 people and possibly as many as 500. The Signal Corps didn't get the warning out in time. Telegraph lines that could have delivered cold wave flags to rural stations were already down when Lieutenant Thomas Mayhew Woodruff tried to send the alert from St. Paul. At Yankton, one of the measuring stations, 18 degrees vanished in 3 minutes when the front hit, and one witness described the sky going from blue to a greenish grey before the world simply disappeared into white. There was one structure in a 6-mile radius of the town of Chester that stayed above 50 degrees through all 4 days of the storm, not the Halverson brothers' frame house with its cast-iron stove and double supply of cottonwood, not the Niedermeyer claim with its new sod walls and German brick chimney, not the Chester town meeting hall that had served as emergency shelter during the last 3 blizzards. One structure, a small cabin with outer walls nobody in the county understood, built by a woman who had been blind since the age of 7, who had arrived in Dakota Territory with $11.40, and who had been told, repeatedly and by people who genuinely believed it, that she would be dead before February. Her name was Astrid Knudsen. She was 29 years old, born in Telemark, Norway, and she had been building things with her hands since she was 8. She built them differently than anyone around her from the inside out, by feel, by pressure, by the ghost cold she could detect moving through a wall where no one else saw a gap. The town of Chester laughed at what she built, and then they knocked on her door. Astrid arrived at the Chester Land Office on the 3rd of April, 1887, having travelled by rail from Milwaukee with a cloth bag containing a change of clothes, a hand adze, a block plane, a folding rule, and a small book of carpentry diagrams her brother Einar had copied by hand with raised thread borders on each figure so she could read them with her fingers. She filed for 160 acres under the Homestead Act of 1862, which required nothing of her except citizenship intention, age, and a willingness to live on the land for 5 years. The land office clerk, a young man named Dodd, read the plat description to her 3 times. She asked him to describe the terrain with his hands, the slope, the draw, the position of the creek, and she stood with her palms out, reading the air around his gestures, then told him which parcel she wanted. Dodd wrote her name in the ledger and didn't know what to make of her, which was the standard response. She had come from a small settlement outside Milwaukee where the Norwegian community had hired her for 2 years to build interior panelling and window casings for 3 houses. The carpenter who trained her, a man named Birger Haug, a boat builder from Drammen, had said after the first month that she was the best student he'd ever had, because she felt the wood tell her when a joint was wrong. She could detect, by running her thumb across a joint, whether it would open under the weight of a heavy Wisconsin winter, and she'd been right every time Birger checked her work with a square. She wasn't using some trick or compensation, she was doing something documented, though the word documented wouldn't have meant anything to her or to Birger. The visual cortex in a person who loses sight before the age of 12 repurposes itself for tactile processing and becomes, in effect, a second set of fingers. Sensitivity sharpens considerably. A 1944 experiment by researchers Super, Kotzin and Dallenbach at Cornell would eventually prove that blind people can detect obstacles and air movement through reflected sound felt as pressure on the face and hands, a phenomenon that became known as facial vision. Studies published much later, in 2015, would show that blind people detect temperature changes 33% more accurately than sighted people, noticing differences as small as 0.4 of a degree Celsius. Astrid didn't have the vocabulary for any of that. She had the ability itself. Carpentry was, for her, not harder than for sighted builders, and in specific ways it was easier. She'd left Milwaukee because the frontier offered something Wisconsin couldn't: land she could own. The Homestead Act was one of the few pieces of American law that didn't care what she looked like or what she could see, requiring only 5 years of residence, a dwelling, and cultivation. She arrived at her 160 acres on the 5th of April, 1887, led the mile from the road by a Norwegian neighbour named Torsten Bakke, who had homesteaded the adjacent quarter section the previous year. He described the terrain as they walked. The land had a slight north-facing slope, which she didn't like, so she asked about the tree line to the northwest, felt the wind's direction on her cheek, and turned 45 degrees to locate what she thought was a natural windbreak. Torsten confirmed there was a low ridge there, maybe 12 feet high, with some scrub willow. She drove a stake and told him that was where she'd build. Torsten asked what kind of structure she had in mind, offered to help her cut sod bricks that same week, and she told him she wanted 2 walls rather than 1. He didn't understand, and most people around her didn't, yet. The $12 and change she'd arrived with was gone by the time she bought 2 rolls of tar paper, 100 board feet of rough-cut pine planking from the Chester Mill, and 50 pounds of square nails. She had nothing left for a cook stove and nothing left for a second trip to the mill. She had a tent from Milwaukee, set it up near the stake she'd driven, and slept in it the first 2 nights while she learned the land with her feet. She walked every boundary she intended to walk at speed, counting paces, building a map she'd carry in her head for the rest of her stay. She found the drawer where cold air pooled. She could feel it on her ankles, colder than the surrounding air by what she estimated to be 6 or 7 degrees, and marked it with a stick so she would never accidentally route a path through it. She located every stone larger than a fist within 50 feet of her stake. There was a man watching from across the road on both mornings. His name was Wilhelm Schroeder, and he had homesteaded the quarter section east of hers in 1885. He was 38, square-shouldered, German-born, and had a 2-room frame house with a proper Acme parlour stove he'd hauled from Watertown on a wagon. He watched Astrid walk her land with her arms slightly out from her sides, turning occasionally, pressing her boot heel into the soil. He said nothing the first day, and on the second day he said from the road that she couldn't build anything blind. She heard him. She was 30 feet away and had already mapped the exact position of his fence post by sound and wind, and she told him she'd built 3 houses in Milwaukee. He said not alone, and she said no, with a teacher, but this one she'd do alone. He told her she'd be dead by Christmas, and she drove her second stake. She started with the foundation that same week, digging a perimeter trench 14 inches deep and laying a single course of flat stones she'd gathered from the drawer. Each stone she picked up, turned in her hands, and placed by weight and shape. Flat stones only, every rounded one rejected by feel. Torsten Bakke came by on the 4th day, watched her set stones for 20 minutes without saying a word, and then picked up a stone and set it down in the trench himself. They worked together, without much conversation, for 3 afternoons. What she was building was an outer wall of rough pine planking, erected first and standing alone, followed by an inner wall of the same planking set 18 inches inside the outer wall, with a cavity 18 inches wide between them. The plan was to fill that cavity, from the ground to the roofline, with whatever insulating material she could pack into it. This was not a standard frontier design. Standard frontier design was a single-wall frame shanty, or a sod house, or a dugout. The shanties, built of green pine from the mills, with boards still twisting as they dried, were notorious for opening gaps large enough to see daylight through by November. Families nailed tar paper over the inside and stuffed rags into cracks, and in a bad winter the inside wall grew ice where the wind found a seam. Astrid's approach had a logic that most people around her had never considered, because most people around her were relying on their eyes to tell them if a wall was solid. A wall can look solid and be a sieve for cold air. She'd felt this in Milwaukee, in Berger's shop, putting her hands on walls in the houses she'd worked in and feeling the cold moving through where she could not see it moving. A gap doesn't have to be visible to be catastrophic. A gap the width of a finger along a single-wall frame shanty can account for 20% of the structure's total heat loss. Two walls with a filled cavity between them give you something a single wall can never give you: a dead zone, a place where neither wind nor temperature gradient can reach. The physics of this is worth stating plainly. Air is actually a superb insulator in theory. A perfectly still column of air has an R value of about R3, 6 to R5, 7 per inch, which is better than most commercial insulation sold today. The problem is that air doesn't stay still when one side of it is cold and the other is warm. The density difference between warm and cold air. Warm air is lighter than cold air drives convection. The warm air rises on the interior face of the gap. The cold air slides down the exterior face, and the loop runs constantly, carrying heat out as efficiently as a pump. The result is that a standard 3-5-inch empty wall cavity provides only about R1 total, which is worse than a single inch of wood. But pack the cavity with material that traps small pockets of air, straw, hay, sawdust, dry moss, and the story changes completely. The fibrous material breaks the air into cells too small for convection to organize. Each tiny pocket stays still, and each tiny pocket earns its theoretical insulation value. A fully packed straw cavity 18 inches thick delivers somewhere between R36 and R45, depending on density and moisture content, which is better than modern fiberglass bats. The same principle makes bird feathers and animal fur work, not the material itself, but the stillness of the air it holds. Astrid didn't have the mathematical language for any of this, but she had the concept arrived at through a different path. She knew from touch that a wall with nothing between two surfaces let cold through. She knew from Milwaukee winters that the warmest spaces she'd ever been in were places where air couldn't move: a packed storage cellar, a snow-buried barn. She knew from Berger that the way to stop something from moving was to give it nowhere to move. She was building what modern building scientists call a double envelope: two complete wall assemblies with an insulated buffer zone between them, a system that was rediscovered in the 1970s as a major advance in energy-efficient construction. She was building it in 1887 because it was the logical answer to a problem she could feel with her hands. The outer wall went up in 12 days, working 6 to 8 hours each day. She nailed boards vertically, tight together, each board pressed against the next by feel before the nail went in. She could tell by the sound of the hammer whether the nail was going into solid wood or hitting a gap. She ran her thumb along every joint after each course, and any joint she could feel air through, she pulled the board, replaned the edge, and reset it. Torsten Bakke brought 2 of his Norwegian neighbours to watch on the 7th day. They stood at the edge of her claim for an hour, and she heard them speaking in low Norwegian. She caught the words blind and alone, and one she couldn't place, but the tone she understood fine. She kept working. When the outer shell was up, she started on the fill. Straw was the primary material. The Chester area had produced a modest wheat harvest in the summer of 1887, and she'd made arrangements in late August, before anyone quite understood what she was building, to purchase the straw from 2 farms at harvest price, roughly 50 cents per 100 pounds. paying with 2 days of work helping Torsten repair his fence line. She'd also asked every farm in a 2-mile radius if they had sawdust from winter-milled lumber and collected 3 wagon loads, since dry sawdust runs to about R2, 5 per inch comparable to straw, maybe slightly less, but it packs denser and holds air pockets in a slightly different geometry. She packed the cavity from the outside through an access panel she'd left at the base of the outer wall, a removable board, 18 inches wide, at ground level on the east face. Working by feel, she pushed straw in with a wooden paddle she'd made from a scrap board and a cut-down broom handle, tamping it with measured pressure, firm enough to eliminate large voids, loose enough not to compress it so tight that the air cells collapsed. Her hands told her when the density was right, because you can't see where the straw is packed properly, but you can feel it. Packed too loose, it compresses further under its own weight and leaves voids. Packed too tight, the air cells crush and the R value drops. The right density is a particular resistance, a specific give when you press, and Berger had taught her to feel that in insulating material the way he'd taught her to feel a tight wood joint. Her hands had 4 years of practice at exactly this. Wilhelm Schroeder came over on the 9th day of packing, when the access panel was still out and straw was visible in the cavity. He stood with his arms crossed and asked what all that was. She told him it was insulation, and when he said she was filling the wall with straw, she confirmed it was straw and sawdust in the lower section. His was a solid German farmer's skepticism, not mean, not quite, but completely dismissive. He'd spent 3 years in the territory and seen a lot of people try things that didn't work, had watched a sod house half cave in under a spring melt, and seen a family try to heat their claim with compressed hay and end up burning the structure down. He said straw catches fire, which wasn't wrong exactly. He was applying valid information to the wrong problem. She told him the straw was between 2 walls and that both walls went from the ground to the roof without a break, so the straw never touched a heat source. He looked at the outer wall, looked at the gap between it and the beginning of the inner framing he could see, and then told her that when the cold came through that outer wall, and it would, she'd have a wet straw wall. And wet straw doesn't insulate, wet straw rots, and she'd have built her house inside a rotten straw box. He was not stupid, and his concern was legitimate. Moisture management in a double wall system is the real engineering challenge, because the outer wall needs to let vapor out rather than trap it. She'd thought about this carefully, and had left a 2-inch gap at the very top of the outer wall, between the top plate and the roofline, with no boarding, a continuous ventilation slot all the way around, below the roof overhang. Cold air couldn't drive rain or snow through it, but moisture could escape. She'd angled the inner roofline so any condensation on the outer wall's interior face would run down and away from the straw. She'd figured this out in the dark of the Milwaukee carpenter shop, thinking through what happened to moisture in a double-paned window she'd touched and found wet between the panes. Water goes where the temperature drops. The temperature drops at the outer wall, and so the outer wall needs to breathe out rather than in. She couldn't explain all of that to Schroeder because he'd walked away, so she kept packing. October arrived with a cold that was honest about itself, not the sudden cold of January, but the slow, building cold of autumn in the Dakotas, temperature dropping 8 or 10 degrees a week, the ground going iron hard, the light going low and amber in the afternoons. Astrid had the outer shell full packed and the inner wall 3/4 up by the 1st of October. She worked by feel and by count, the inner wall constructed with exactly the same approach as the outer, boards vertical, every joint tested by thumb before the nail set. The inner wall also raised a question Schroeder had put in her mind that she'd turned over for 2 weeks. What did the floor do? A well-insulated wall loses most of its benefit if the floor is single-layer pine board over open joists with nothing between the boards and the frozen ground. Cold enters a structure from below as readily as from the sides. She'd given herself a crawl space of 14 inches accessed by a removable section of foundation board on the south side, and packed that crawl space with sawdust to a depth of 12 inches. Over the subfloor, she laid 2 layers of pine planking with a half-inch gap between them filled with dry grass, giving the floor approximately R8 to R10, depending on how you counted the layers, dramatically better than bare board. Torsten Bakke brought a man named Lars Gundersen to see the building in the second week of October. Lars had been in Dakota Territory since 1883 and was considered fairly one of the more experienced builders in the county, the man people asked about construction questions. He walked around the exterior of Astrid's cabin once, slowly, his hands in his pockets, and then stopped at the corner where the 2 wall planes met and said, in Norwegian, "The corner joint?" He was looking at the corner where the outer wall met itself, because a double wall structure has to turn a corner, and at a corner, the 18-inch cavity between the 2 walls has to somehow continue. She'd solved this by building the outer wall around all 4 sides first, then the inner wall as a complete second box inside it, with the corners of the inner box offset from the corners of the outer box by 9 inches. The cavity continued uninterrupted around every corner. Lars bent down and looked at the base of the outer corner where she'd left a small inspection gap for exactly this moment, then straightened up and asked, in Norwegian and not addressing anyone in particular, how she'd thought of that. Astrid told him from the doorway she'd heard his footsteps stop and recognized by the sound where he was standing that the cold comes through corners, that a corner is where 2 cold surfaces meet, and that she wanted the warm air inside to see only one surface, the inner wall, with the cold air only ever touching the outer wall and never the same surface. He stood there for a moment longer and then raised the straw fire hazard concern. She told him the straw was sealed, that both walls went floor to roof without a gap, and the straw never had oxygen to burn with. He thought about it, because he was the kind of man who could follow reasoning even when it surprised him, and told her that if it worked it was a good idea, then left. It was the closest she'd gotten to a compliment, and it didn't quite get all the way there. By the 1st of November 1887, the cabin was complete. It was 14 feet by 16 feet in outer dimension, with an inner living space of 11 feet by 13 feet, the 18-inch double wall ate into the interior, which was the expected price of the system. The roof was a steep gable, pitched at roughly 11 in 12 because she'd asked Torsten to describe the angle of a Norwegian mountain cabin roof and show her with his hands, and she'd copied that. Steep enough that snow loaded briefly and slid. She shingled it herself with split cedar from a batch she'd traded 2 days of fence work to acquire, each shingle split and set by feel. Overlapping by an amount she measured with her hands span 4 inches, consistent across every course. The ridge cap she packed with tar from a pot she'd bought in Chester, heating it over a fire and spreading it with a paddle she could feel the resistance of. She had a cook stove, a small one costing $42 she'd earned in Chester during September doing interior carpentry work for the new assay office. The cook stove went inside the inner wall, with the flue pipe running up through a collar she'd made from sheet tin and sealed with furnace cement. The flue pipe passed through the inner wall, then through an insulated chase made of tin and packed with mineral clay, no straw anywhere near the pipe up through the roof. The stove was positioned against the east inner wall so that when she opened the firebox door she was facing east, and she always knew where east was. She'd oriented the cabin deliberately, door on the south, opening away from the prevailing northwest wind, south wall slightly longer to catch any solar warmth in the low January sun. She'd measured the sun's arc by the warmth on her face during 3 different days in September, turning slowly until she felt the maximum heat, then used that as true south and set her foundation stakes accordingly. She had 11 cords of wood stacked under the roof overhang on the east side of the cabin, behind a firewood windbreak she'd built from stacked sod 3 feet thick. That was more wood than most single-wall claim shanties in the county used in a full winter. She'd cut and hauled it in September and October, working with Torsten 4 days a week and paying him with labour in return. Wilhelm Schroeder, passing on the road the week she finished stacking, counted the cords by eye and said, loud enough for her to hear from the door, that 11 cords for one small woman seemed like a lot to ask what she thought she was heating. She said nothing. She'd already modelled the heating load in her head by feel. She knew how much warmth the stove put out. She knew how thick her walls were. She knew what cold felt like moving through different materials, and she thought she'd need 4, maybe 5 cords for the winter, with 11 as doubled insurance. He said she'd wasted 2 months of labour on a box that would be colder inside than his parlour by December, and she closed the door. The first week of December, 1887, brought temperatures down to -14. She kept the stove at moderate output, a small, steady fire rather than a roaring one. She measured the indoor temperature the only way she could, by feel, by what her hands told her when she held them still in the middle of the room. She'd calibrated her sense of this in Milwaukee, in the carpenter shop, where Berger had kept a mercury thermometer she could not read, but where she'd learned, over 2 years, to match her body's red to the number he called out. She thought the cabin was holding at around 52 to 55 degrees with the fire banked, climbing to 65 with the fire actively burning. She used less than a quarter of a cord in the first 2 weeks of December. She knew the walls were working because of something she could feel that others could not see. The inner wall surface. In a cold, single-wall cabin, the inside of the wall frosts moisture in the warm interior air, hits the cold wall surface and condenses or freezes, and in the morning you see ice on the inside walls and frost patterns on the boards. Astrid felt the inner wall with her palm every morning, the way a doctor checks a forehead for fever. Her inner wall was warm, not warm like a stove, but warm like a room. The 18 inches of packed straw between the outer and inner wall had absorbed the cold so completely that the inner wall's interior face held near room temperature, and her hands told her this every morning for 3 months. She didn't tell anyone, because there was no one to tell who would have believed her. The Halvorsen brothers, Eric and Nils, farming 320 acres together in the half-section west of Chester, had the nicest house in 6 miles. It was a proper 2-story frame structure built by a carpenter they'd hired from Brookings in the summer of 1886, with pine framing, horizontal clapboard siding, a full cellar dug out by hand, a parlour stove and a kitchen range. They'd spent $900 building it, not counting the lot. In December of 1887, Eric Halvorsen told 3 men in the Chester General Store that he expected his house to hold 60 degrees through any weather the territory could produce, because he had a full cellar of coal and his walls were well made. He said this in front of Lars Gunderson, who said nothing, because Lars had seen Astrid's cabin. By December 15, with the temperature outside at -21, the Halvorsen house held 51 degrees in the parlour, with both stoves burning. In the bedrooms upstairs it was 38. The clapboard siding on the north wall had opened 3 gaps where the green pine had dried and shrunk, the kind of gaps that bleed cold air at a rate of roughly 18 cubic feet per minute per linear foot in a 20-mile-per-hour wind. Eric Halvorsen stuffed rags in the gaps, and the rags blew out by morning. Astrid's cabin held 62 degrees with a banked fire. She did not know the exact number, but she knew it felt like a mild October afternoon inside, while she could hear the wind on the outer wall and feel the vibration of it in the floor. The 11th of January 1888 started like a gift. The morning high in Chester was 43 degrees, and by 11 o'clock it had climbed to 46. The James River ice, which had been groaning for 2 days, went quiet in the warm air. A boy named Halvard Niedermeyer, age 9, went out to the family's field to gather fence stakes his father had left in the snow, wearing no coat because his mother said it was practically spring. And he was back inside before noon, which meant he was lucky. Astrid woke on January 12 with the air in her cabin at 64 degrees. She'd banked the fire the night before, and it was still going. That was the consequence of well-insulated walls, where a banked fire holds heat through the night instead of hemorrhaging it to the outside. She let the stove go low, ate breakfast, and went outside to check on her wood pile. She could tell by the temperature on her face that it was unusually warm, and she paused at the south door for a moment, facing southwest, her face reading the air. There was something in it, not the warmth, but something underneath the warmth, the tension, a quality she'd learned to notice in Milwaukee winters standing on the shore of Lake Michigan. Because warm air in January doesn't always mean warm weather is coming, and sometimes it means something is about to slam into it. She went back inside, counted the pieces in her indoor woodpile by hand, went back outside and brought in 14 more from the covered stack, filled the water barrel to the top, and pulled the extra blanket down from the shelf above the door. At 12:45 p.m., the wind hit the outer wall of her cabin like a hand striking a drum. The temperature at Yankton, 70 miles southeast, dropped 18 degrees in 3 minutes when the front arrived. In Chester, the change was perhaps slightly less abrupt, but not by much. The 46-degree morning became a 20-degree afternoon in less than 2 hours. By 5 o'clock, the Signal Corps thermometer at the Chester post office read -8, and by 9 p.m. it was -22. The wind was out of the northwest at between 30 and 40 miles per hour, driving a fine, powdered snow that was less like weather and more like sand particles so small they passed through wool, through oilcloth, through every gap in every structure in a 6-mile radius. The gaps were the problem, as they always were. In a frame shanty with single-wall construction and green pine siding, a winter wind at 35 miles per hour finds every crack the dried lumber has opened. The crack doesn't have to be large at 35 miles per hour. A 1/8-inch gap along a 6-foot wallboard drives roughly 6 cubic feet of -22-degree air per minute into the interior. With 20 linear feet of siding on a standard claim shanty, that's 2 or 3 board lengths on each wall, each with a crack, and you're moving over 100 cubic feet of Arctic air into the structure every minute, while the stove tries to heat it before it reaches the occupants. The stove always loses that fight. The Halverson house, the $900 house, with its parlour stove and full cellar of coal, went to 31 degrees in the main floor parlour by 10 p.m. on January 12. Eric Halverson was burning coal as fast as the stove would take it. The coal had a calorific value of roughly 13,000 British thermal units per pound, and he was burning 8 pounds an hour, which is a respectable fire. The cold was winning anyway. Cold air at -22, driven by a 35-mile-per-hour wind, carries away heat at a rate that a standard single-wall frame structure simply cannot counter. The walls were losing roughly 3,400 British thermal units per hour through conduction and air infiltration combined, and the stove was putting in maybe 2,800 British thermal units per hour of useful heat, with the rest going up the chimney. By midnight, Nils Halverson's water bucket, sitting on the kitchen floor 6 feet from the range, had a crust of ice on it. The Niedermeyer soddy-held Bettersode has real mass, and mass resists temperature change. But the Niedermeyers had not built their walls deep enough. 3 feet of sod delivers R15 to R20, but their walls were 2 feet, giving them R10 to R14, decent but not deep enough for what was coming. By 2 in the morning the interior had dropped to 38 degrees, and Heinrich Niedermeyer was burning his fence posts because the woodpile had run out in the night. In the Chester meeting hall, 3 families who'd been caught away from their claims when the storm hit the Webbers, the Jansons, and a widow named Margit Ars who'd been visiting from her farm 3 miles out, were sleeping in their coats around a cast-iron heating stove. The town had kept filled with wood since early evening. The hall was 41 degrees at its centre, colder near the walls. Margit Ars, who was 64 and had survived the hard winter of 1880 and 2 other blizzards before this one, sat with her back against the stove's leg and said nothing, because she'd seen worse, and she didn't say that she just sat there. The wind ran for 4 days. Inside Astrid's cabin, the temperature did not drop below 51 degrees at any point during the storm. She knew this by feel, by what her hands told her when she held them at rest in the room's centre, and by what her face told her when she stood still and listened to the wind on the outer wall. She could hear the storm and feel it in the vibration of the floor, a low, continuous tremor that came through the 18 inches of straw-packed wall and arrived as something muffled, like thunder heard from underground. She could feel the outer wall's presence as a kind of atmospheric pressure, cold, busy, working hard at the exterior surface, but she couldn't feel it at the inner wall. The inner wall was simply room temperature. She kept the fire small because she understood, without having access to the formal physics, that her walls were doing the work the stove would otherwise have to do. In a standard single-wall shanty, the stove fights the weather on behalf of the occupant. In her cabin, the walls absorbed the weather's energy and neutralized it before it reached the interior, reducing the stove to maintenance rather than combat. She burned perhaps 3/4 of a cord in the first 2 days of the storm, a rate that would give her 11 cords of duration for something like a month of continuous blizzard, which no blizzard in recorded Dakota Territory history had ever lasted. On the 2nd day, she heard someone at the outer door. Her cabin had 2 doors, one set in the outer wall and one set in the inner wall, separated by the 18-inch cavity at the south face, a deliberate airlock she'd built into the design. The outer door was uninsulated, just 2 boards thick. The inner door was a full 3-inch pine slab she'd made herself, rabbited and fitted tight, with a felt strip she'd cut from a scrap of old coat nailed along all 4 edges. When the outer door opened, it let in the storm, but the inner door, 3 feet away, held, and the temperature between the 2 doors dropped perhaps 15 degrees when the outer opened, while the inner held 61 degrees on the room side. She opened the outer door. Standing in the gap between the 2 doors, hunched against the wind, was Wilhelm Schroeder. He had walked from his frame house 3/4 of a mile east along the road in conditions the Signal Corps would later describe as near-zero visibility, with a wind chill calculated to be somewhere around -60 degrees Fahrenheit. He had a wool scarf over his face, and he was shaking. He was not a man who asked for things, and she could hear it in the quality of the silence he brought through the outer door, not the silence of a man who had nothing to say, but the silence of a man who had to push very hard to say what he was about to say. He told her his stove had cracked. She opened the inner door. He came in and said nothing for a long moment. She heard his breathing slow and heard the shaking diminish. She'd set the inner room at what she gauged to be 63 degrees, and he'd walked from a house that was probably hovering around 28. She told him to sit down, and he sat on the bench she'd built along the east wall. After a few minutes, he said her floor was warm, and she said yes. He touched the inner wall and said that wall was warm too, and she said yes. He asked how. She told him not the technical vocabulary she didn't have, but the reasoning she did. The 2 walls, the 18 inches of straw between them, why the straw held the air still, why still air couldn't carry heat away, why the outer wall took all the wind's punishment while the inner wall sat behind it in another weather zone entirely. She talked for maybe 10 minutes, unhurried. He listened without interrupting, which was unusual for him. When she finished, he said he'd told her she'd be dead by Christmas, and she said she knew. He said he'd been wrong about that, and she said he had. He sat with that for a moment, and then told her his stove had cracked at the firebox, that the metal had split, and that he couldn't get a fire going without the smoke coming into the room. She told him he could stay, that there was room enough. He did. He also sent his neighbour, a young Dane named Mads Christofferson, who had a claim half a mile north, and whose shanty had lost its door in the first night's wind, and Christopherson came on the third day. And there were 3 of them in an 11 by 13 room that held 60 degrees, which was warmer than the Chester Town Hall by 19 degrees and warmer than the Halverson House by 30. On the 4th day, the wind dropped. The temperature rose to -4, which felt almost moderate after what had come before, and the snow settled. Lars Gunderson was the first to come out from Chester, half a mile to the west, pulling a wool-wrapped bundle on a hand sled. He'd been thinking about Astrid's cabin since October, and wanted to know if his instinct had been right. He arrived at her outer door, knocked, and she opened it. He could feel the warm air from the inner room, even with the outer door just cracked, and he pulled back his scarf and asked how warm it was inside. She told him to come in. He came through both doors and stood in the room for a moment, hands out from his sides the way she walked her land, reading the temperature by feel the way a person does when they've spent 20 years in Dakota winters and their body has learned to calibrate. He guessed 60 degrees, and she said she thought so. Schroeder was sitting on the bench. Lars looked at him and said his stove had cracked, which wasn't a question because the whole town knew by now. Schroeder said yes, looked at the floor for a moment, then looked up and said the wall system works, that he'd say that plainly it works. Lars nodded because he already knew. Minnie Mae Freeman, over in Mira Valley, Nebraska, 90 miles southwest, had tied 13 students together with twine and led them through that same storm to a farmhouse, because her sod schoolhouse lost its door and its roof to the first hour's wind. She became famous for it and received 83 marriage proposals by mail in the months following. 3 children died 82 yards from a farmhouse in Plainview, Nebraska, led outside by their teacher Lois Royce, who ran out of fuel in the schoolhouse and could not see the building through the whiteout 82 yards, less than the length of a football field. The story of what happened in Chester of a blind Norwegian woman's cabin being the only structure in the district that didn't require emergency action during the 4-day storm spread in the Way frontier. Stories spread, slowly and without embellishment, which is to say with plenty of embellishment. By March it had been told in the general stores in Chester, Huron and De Smet. By April it reached a Norwegian language newspaper in Minneapolis, which got the physics wrong but got the essential fact right, that the double wall, filled cavity design had outperformed every conventional structure around it by a margin that was not close. Astrid filed her first proof of residence documentation at the Chester Land Office in April 1888, and the clerk Dodd was still there. He read the form to her, and she signed it. She proved up the claim in April 1892, and the land was hers. Wilhelm Schroeder built a new stove surround that spring, and came over twice to ask Astrid about the cavity construction. Taking notes, he had a neighbour read back to him in German, because his written English was unreliable. He rebuilt the north wall of his house that summer with a double wall section, not the whole house, just the north wall, which took the prevailing winter wind and told Lars Gunderson that it made a measurable difference by the following November. He didn't go back to Astrid's cabin and say this directly to her, because he wasn't that kind of man, but he didn't call her blind to her face again. Lars Gunderson built his next claim shanty for his son, who filed in 1889 as a full double-wall structure from the beginning. He used Astrid's corner offset technique and went to her twice in the summer of 1889 with questions she answered by demonstrating with her hands, pressing the back of his hand against the inner wall surface and then against the outer so he could feel the temperature differential between them even in summer. Torsten Bakke proved up his own claim in 1893 and moved his family from Oslo. He built their Dakota house himself, double wall, straw-packed, with the tight corner joints she'd shown him. He put a plaque above the interior door that said, in Norwegian, "Built in the method of A.K., the method of Astrid Knudsen." She lived on the claim until 1908, when she sold it at a profit that would have seemed hallucinatory to the woman who'd arrived with $11 in April of 1887. She moved to Minneapolis, where she'd heard there was work for people who could teach carpentry, and she taught at the Minnesota School for the Blind for 11 years. Here is what Astrid understood that the people around her did not. Heat loss through a wall is not a function of what the wall looks like, it is a function of what the wall does. A single layer of boards can look solid and beautiful and be a colander for cold air if the lumber has dried and opened gaps, or if the framing provides no barrier to convection, or if there is no break between the cold exterior and the warm interior. Looking at a wall tells you nothing about what it does with heat. You have to know this from calculation, or from feel, or from years of pressing your hands against surfaces in cold weather and reading what they tell you. Astrid had the feel. She had it because she'd had no choice but to develop it. In the same way that the brain denied the visual cortex repurposes that cortex for the senses it does have. What neuroscientists now call cross-modal plasticity, the measurable, documented rerouting of cortical resources from vision to touch and thermal perception in people who are blind from childhood, gave her a set of diagnostic tools that her sighted neighbours simply didn't have, not because they were less intelligent, but because they had eyes, and eyes told them a wall looked solid, and they believed the eyes. She believed her hands. The double-walled principle, two complete wall assemblies separated by an insulated cavity, is not exotic. It is the logical conclusion of one question: how do you prevent a temperature gradient from driving convection through your insulation? The answer is to fill the space with material small enough to prevent convective cells from forming. Straw, hay, sawdust, wool, cellulose, fiberglass, the material is almost secondary to the principle. Every modern, energy-efficient house built to the passive house standard uses some version of this. When the passive house movement was formalized in Germany in the early 1990s, its founders described it as a new discovery, but it wasn't new, it was physics. A woman who had never heard the word physics in an academic context had built her Dakota claim shanty around that physics in 1887, not because she was taught it, but because her hands couldn't lie to her about what cold air does when it finds a path through a wall. The schoolhouse blizzard of the 12th of January, 1888, killed somewhere between 235 and 500 people across Dakota Territory, Nebraska, Minnesota, and Kansas. The ones who survived in structures were almost universally in structures with mass sod walls, stone cellars, snowdrifts piled against log walls. The ones who died in structures were almost universally in single-wall frame shanties with dried lumber gaps that the storm found and used. A 68-degree temperature swing in 5 hours was not something that any standard frontier construction could handle without help. The ones who survived without mass had to have sealed their walls completely, stopped the convection at the wall face itself, and interposed enough dead material between the storm and the interior to absorb what no fire could fully counter. The ones with a building inside a building stayed warm. There was one such building in a 6-mile radius of Chester, Dakota Territory, on the night of the 12th of January 1888. The woman who built it was blind. She found every gap by feel before it became a gap, packed every cavity to the density her hands told her was right, and built the corner joints the way a joiner builds a corner for the worst case rather than the average case, because she'd felt corners leak cold and refused to let hers do the same. She used 11 cords of wood across the whole winter and burned 4.5. The rest she sold in the spring. The cabin stood until 1924, when it was demolished to make way for a farmstead expansion. By then, the straw in the cavity was still, after 37 years, dry and intact.